The solution is not to take Africans and move them to Europe. The solution is to free Africa from certain Europeans who exploit it and allow these people to live off what they have. This is called the CFA, Franc, a colonial currency that France prints for 14 African nations, and by virtue of which it exploits the resources of this nation. This is a child working in a gold mine in Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is one of the poorest nations in the world. For Burkina Faso, which has gold, France prints colonial currency. In return, it demands that 50% of everything Burkina Faso exports ends up in the coffers of the French treasury. The gold that this child crawls into a tunnel to extract mostly ends up in the coffers of the French state. So, what if I told you that a 34-year-old military captain with no economic degree took over one of the poorest countries in Africa and in just 2 years increased its GDP by over 17%, paid off national debts, and launched the biggest infrastructure revolution in the country's history? And what if I told you that he did all this while refusing the presidential salary, rejecting IMF loans, and telling Western powers to back off? This isn't a fairy tale, it's the story of Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, and it might just be the most important leadership case study in Africa today. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Strategic Lens, where we go beyond the headlines to understand the real power dynamics that are shaping our world. An old African proverb says, when the music changes, so does the dance. For decades, the economic music in Africa has been composed by Western powers through the IMF and the World Bank, forcing African nations to dance to their doom. But in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré has changed the music entirely. Today, I'm going to break down how this young leader is creating a revolutionary economic blueprint that challenges everything we have been taught about development in Africa. What do you think would happen if more African countries follow TR's model? Think about it as we explore his strategy. To understand why TR's approach is so revolutionary, we need to understand what he is fighting against. Since the 1980s, African countries facing economic difficulties have been offered a deal by the IMF and World Bank: take our loans, but follow our structural adjustment programs known as SAP. These SAPs promised economic growth and follow a simple formula: 1. Get government spending on public services, 2. Privatize state-owned enterprises, 3. Open markets to foreign competition, and 4. Focus on exporting raw materials. SAPs created what I call the colonial economy 2.0, keeping African nations dependent on foreign loans, selling raw materials at low prices, buying back finished goods at high prices, and trapped in circles of depth and poverty. But what if there was another way? What if an African country could break free from this cycle? How many African countries do you think have successfully escaped the SAP trap in the last 40 years? The answer might shock you. Ibrahim Traoré didn't rise through elite economic institutions. He was a military captain who took power in 2022 when Burkina Faso was facing multiple crises. When offered the presidential salary of $76,000 a year, a fortune in Burkina Faso, trusted keeping only his captain's salary of 580 francs per month. Now, this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It signaled his entire philosophy: leadership through service, not extraction, the philosophy that drives the 4 revolutionary economic strategies that we are about to explore. And speaking about service to one's country, there is nothing more fundamental to a nation's wealth than controlling its own resources, which brings us to Traoré's first revolutionary move. For decades, the structural development programs imposed by the IMF have pushed African countries to privatize natural resources, allowing foreign companies to extract wealth while leaving little behind. In Burkina, gold accounts for about 80% of export earnings, but before Dr. most of this gold left the country unrefined, with profits flowing to foreign companies. Solution was bold: 1. Nationalized gold mines, to build Burkina's first national gold refinery that processes 150 tons annually, and 3. Stop the export of unrefined gold. The results: more jobs, more value, more revenue staying in Burkina Faso, but then controlling your resources is just the first step. What trade did next send shockwaves through international financial institutions and challenged decades of economic orthodoxy. Stay with me to discover how a young captain from one of the world's poorest countries dared to say no to the most powerful financial institutions on the planet. TR's next move was even more audacious, targeting the very foundation of the Western economic model in Africa. Traore rejected loans from the IMF and the World Bank, a move that shocked Western economists. But he understood something fundamental. These loans came with conditions that undermined sovereignty and perpetrated dependency. Think of it like this: if someone helps you build a house and demand that you must let them live in it and dictate what furniture you must buy and who can visit, is that really help or control? Instead, Ibrahim Traoré focused on self-reliance through resource management, cutting wasteful government spending and preventing capital flight through corruption. The results speak for themselves. In just 2 years, the GDP of Burkina Faso increased from $18.8 billion to $22 billion, while paying off debts. But financial independence alone doesn't build a nation. You need something much more tangible, something you can literally drive on. And this is where TR's genius really shines. But here is the shocking fact: from independence to the time Ibrahim Traoré took power, Burkina Faso had just 3,000 kilometers of paved roads. When Ibrahim Traoré first approached private companies about building new roads for the country, he discovered something outrageous. Their prices were astronomical, far higher than what the same work cost in developed countries. So, what did Traoré do? Something no one expected. The first is that he purchased over 900 pieces of construction equipment, a procurement so massive that when the convoy passed through neighboring Ghana, people lined the streets in amazement. Secondly, he launched a nationwide program to train thousands of Burkina Faso youth to operate this equipment. And third, he set an ambitious goal to build 3,000 to 5,000 kilometers of paved roads every year. Let that sink in. What took decades, he's now doing it annually at the fraction of what neighboring countries pay. Farmers can bring produce to market without spoilage. Children can access schools more easily. Healthcare become more accessible, and new businesses emerge along transport roads. But roads and gold are just part of the story. The true genius of Traoré's model lies in what happens next: a complete reimagination of what African development can look like. And it starts with the most basic human need of all. The structural development programs typically pushed African countries to focus on cash crops for export, creating nations that grow what they don't eat and eat what they don't grow. Traoré flipped these nations by one: distributing tractors and seeds to local farmers, 2 building processing plants for crops like cotton and tomatoes, and 3 investing in local food production to reduce import dependency. When people can feed themselves, they have achieved the most fundamental form of sovereignty. And Burkina Faso is steadily moving towards that goal. But Traoré understood that true independence requires more than economic transformation. It requires psychological liberation. In a powerful symbolic move, he banned British and French colonial wigs and gowns in courts, replacing them with traditional Burkina attire made from locally woven Paso d'Anfani fabric. Now, this wasn't just about clothing, it was about supporting local artisans and industries and breaking colonial mindsets that as you foreign is better. Economic development isn't just about GDP figures. It's about who owns, controls, and benefits from that growth. And of course, no revolution comes without challenges. And bold model for African development faces significant hurdles, both internally and from powerful external forces that prefer the status quo. Now, let's be clear, faces enormous challenges: security threats, institutional development needs, and international pressure. And Trace model isn't without risk. Nationalized industries must avoid inefficiencies. Technical partnerships are still needed. Regional alliances must be strengthened. But what makes his approach revolutionary is that it offers a path to development centered on sovereignty, and a model that prioritizes the welfare of citizens over foreign interests. So what can other African leaders learn from the Traoré playbook? The first thing is that they should prioritize local solutions, invest in equipment and training rather than outsourcing, control your resources, ensure your country captures the full value of your natural resources, then question foreign help and also lead by example, cut waste and demonstrate personal integrity. The most important lesson might be this: Africa has the resources, the talent, the capability to develop on its own terms. What's often lacking isn't capacity but courage. As we move towards the end of this analysis of Ibrahim Traoré's revolutionary approach, let's reflect on what his example means, not just to Burkina Faso, but for Africa and the entire global South. Ibrahim's approach is not just a model, it's a declaration of possibility. And this reminds us of another African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Tring that African nations can go both fast and far when they trust their own people and prioritize their own interests in a world where we are told that there is no alternative to the dominant economic system. Ibrahim Traoré is proving that alternative do not only exist, they thrive. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. If you found this analysis valuable, share this with someone who needs to hear this message of possibility. This is Asar from the Strategic Lens, helping you see beyond the headlines. Bye.